Are you good, Dr. Lyle? Can you hear me
I'm
okay?
good, Dr. Lyon. Very good to see you again, as always.
Yep.
And I'm curious about where it is that we're going to go today and what we're going to add to the story that you've been painting.
Well, great. I think before we get into what we're going to do today, we should do some introductions. And
Mhm.
I'm Tania Lyon, and I'm a person who has lost half my weight or more than half my weight, depending on the day. So it's right in that 50% of my body weight loss. And I have gone public with my story for a couple of different reasons. One is that I wanted to show the complexity of such a health journey and what it meant to lose weight. And for me, this has been one of the most complex processes of my life. And I wanted to showcase that complexity and speak truth to that in a way that is authentic to what I've experienced over the course of my lifetime. And I'm doing that through Transform Shadows. And Transform Shadows is really about both the hope and the struggle that goes with such a journey and what it takes to really do that transformation, which is centered in action. It's both mental and physical actions, and it's also about ongoing mental processes that take scientific knowledge and integrate it with the personal. And so that's really where we're here today, as we're going to look at food and hunger and some of the concepts that revolve around food and hunger. But before we get into that, Dr. Lyle, I want people to know a little bit about you as well.
Gotcha. Well, I'm just glad to be part of this, Tanya. Your story and the way you try to bring in so many of these different elements really has sort of scratched back the uh, the a little veil of ignorance that comes with this. This is a complicated process. My background is in this space comes through the book that I wrote with Alan Goldhammer, The Pleasure Trap, and which was born of 40 years of experience in at True North Health Center at basically using water fasting, uh, preceding the reintroduction of a very healthy natural foods diet and basically restoring people's health from all kinds of different pathological conditions. And there's really nothing like it. In other words, there's nothing like watching that process happen so predictably, so consistently, and so surprisingly. Medicine is not aware of how potent that is. But certainly one of the things that we get to observe is we get to see people's lifelong battles with weight disappear. In other words, we get to watch that process, and we get to see that they can, in fact, be in a space where they can be, under control of that problem, which seems like a miracle. It's not easy to maintain it, though. And so your journey and how you've essentially documented this for yourself and now you're sharing it with other people, I find to be very valuable because there have been other people before that have done this, and that their comments have been useful and important to people. But yours is as you're an educator and systematizer. This is someone now taking what it is that many of us have tried to share in this space about food choices and this process and the confidence that we have in the process. But now to me, you're super interesting talking lab rat. You know what I mean? We've got, yeah, and so I'm delighted to share this exploration that we're doing as we try to get a more and more complete picture of how difficult this journey is.
And I'm glad you mentioned the difficulty of the journey for people, because one of the surprises to me is that some of my audience and from multiple directions has been people who are doing this for health reasons who don't need to lose weight. And they have found that a lot of the ideas that I have centered in this space around the difficulty of it and some of the processes, those ring true for them as well as for people who have to lose weight. So I think it's important to keep that audience in mind today as well, because we're talking about food and hunger. And to use this space to talk about it, I've been using a metaphor, and it's been the metaphor of building fires. And I've built two kind of fires in my life. I've built the fire around food that is the garbage fire, and that is the food that is of the standard American diet. And that particular food goes into flames really fast. It's really papery, it's explosive, and it leaves me cold afterwards and empty. And the shadows of eating that way started to haunt me until the point where I couldn't ignore the force of those shadows anymore, and the fear of what I was doing to myself that haunted me particularly at night, but all day long with the choices that I was making that I seemed unable to get control of. And so what I did was I converted to a plant-based diet. I eat without salt, oil, and sugar, as well as a number of other what I call trigger foods, because I feel those foods cause agitation in my body. And what I don't feel when I build the second kind of fire is that agitation. And so the second kind of fire relates to satiation, which is a warm and comfortable fire, which is about eating, but it's also about what happens after I eat and that absence of agitation. And so I feel warm and comfortable in the space of that particular fire. And so today, what I want to focus on is helping people understand food choices to help them understand how to build that slow burn fire of healthy foods to avoid some of those explosive junk food garbage fires that can occur around the standard American diet. And to do that, I thought we'd take a little bit different look at this. And instead of starting with the foods, we're going to start broadly. And I really want to tap some of your expertise in the work that you've done around the pleasure trap and around the psychological dimensions of this process, and look at some of those ideas that relate to humans and food, and humans and their hunger drive. And so I'm thinking that if we could start with a very broad discussion and then work our way down, funneling down into specific topics, that would be a good approach today.
Sure. I think without understanding human nature and the problem that the pleasure trap has imported on top of human nature, we can't understand then the train wreck that we're trying to fix. We're designed for managing in an environment of scarcity. So, in fact, all animals are. So, animals are happy when they live in times of abundance, but they are designed to be tough little creatures that can face the adversity of scarcity. And so, they're very efficient at triangulating on the best course of action that gives them the highest payoff. To be technical about it, folks, it's literally you're trading calories for calories if you're an animal. How many calories do you need to expend in mental and physical energy in order to get the calories that you then need out of the environment to eat? It's like literally, it's a math problem. And so it's going to turn out that that math problem means that all animals are pretty ruthless at trying to get the best deal they can. In other words, they're like bargain shoppers, at a mall. They want the best deal. And so the problem with that is that there are, particularly for omnivores like ourselves, there's going to be what we call feast and famine. So there's going to be times when what there is to eat is barely enough, and it's not that high calorie density. It's not that exciting. And then there's going to be times when there's feast, where suddenly something that's particularly rich for a species comes into season and it's available. The problem that we have today is that we have created artificial food, and that food that we've created is all super rich. And so now we've built our own bizarre zoo, where the zookeepers just give us this super rich food, which means that we're faced with the prospect, what would seem to be nirvana, is that you could surround yourself with gluttonous food your whole life. That's what's happened. And so all you have to do is look at it's like America is the epicenter of this, because we're the epicenter of this extraordinary explosion of food processing capability, et cetera, in the last 50 years. And then there's like shock waves as you see the commercial, extraordinary commercial influence of that as it widens and widens around the globe. So you see the pleasure trap that has been perfected in the United States. I've been told, like, an epicenter of this, by the way, is New Jersey. Okay, it's like literally there's laboratories there studying human pleasure response to the artificially heightened concentration of foodstuffs, and through there they figured out basically how to hyperstimulate the pleasure pathway in the brain, and therefore this is exactly how the food needs to be concocted. And so that's all of the other things that we talk about, and there are many different things that we have to consider. There's social issues, there's personal self-discipline issues, there's so many different things. But unless we understand that the pleasure trap is there and that it's not our fault that it's there, and in fact it's a daunting and intimidating obstacle, that thing is our nemesis. It's sitting on the other side of the chessboard of anybody who wants to get well and anybody that wants to lose weight. In other words, if you want to do a good job, the pleasure trap, it's the geniuses in New Jersey that are playing against you. And so that's what makes it difficult. You can beat them, but as you and I look at this and we look at your journey, we see the kinds of strategies and what it took. And it's not an easy task. So that's the biggest problem that's in the room. And then what we are doing is trying to figure out how on earth to manage our journey as we get a handle on that.
One of the things you said in the last episode that I think is worth highlighting for our viewers today is that humans weren't designed to handle this problem. And I think that can be an incredibly validating idea as people struggle and come up against this over and over again. In my own life, I first got success in the plant-based world 11 years before I finally got success. So I had an 11-year failure between success, extreme success, and then falling off. I talk about it with French fries being the choice that I made, and I couldn't get back after that. But the reality is that I was on a trajectory to fail because there was so many things that I did not understand at that point in my life. So part of what I want to do is bring to light that sort of thing. But I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit more on the fact that we are not designed to solve this problem, because again, that's both validating and it can be frustrating, but it also helps to know what you're up against when you do this journey, I think.
It sure does, because people will try to figure out why it is that they are failing. And they will wind up with a lot of ideas that make superficial sense, but will lead them down, blind alleys. The truth is that we were designed to be extremely efficient. That's why it's hard to describe how fantastic life is. In other words, life is brilliantly engineered. So this is why the world over, in a gruesome way to tell this, but in the world over, you'll see that predators that never had any instruction from their mothers, they automatically will attack and stalk prey that are the weak, the sick, the slow, the isolated, and the injured. They'll look for incredibly subtle differences in, for example, an animal's gait, and they'll pick up the fact that that animal is slightly compromised. Maybe it has a little hurt hoof, and that's the difference. So that the predator knows that's the one I'm going for. And because why? Because it's not easy to succeed. And the difference between success and failure in life can be on a razor's edge. And so you have to be as efficient as possible. So you can imagine how problematic it is for a human being in the modern world with the incredible bounty that we have, that you're no longer on a razor's edge. You can't possibly starve to death in the United States. And in fact, basically, even in Africa today, as a result of innovations largely, basically almost entirely in the West of the last 50 years, even in Africa today, far more people die of diseases of dietary excess than die of starvation or deficiency. It's like 10 years ago, it was already at a factor of 3 to 1 or something like that. So even in places where it's dirt poor, even there we're starting to see the pleasure trap literally get past starvation as the biggest health threat that there is. So, but here in our country, it's not even close. I mean, this is the cause of the overwhelming majority of disease, early death, and disability. And it's, again, even if people know sort of superficially what they ought to be doing, the ability to execute on it is close to zero. In other words, if everybody that gets the idea, few people know the level of food and food science that you and I have been exposed to. They haven't heard of John McDougall. They haven't heard of T. Colin Campbell. We have, and many of our listeners have, but most people haven't. But they know they should be eating fruits and vegetables. That they know. Okay, this is not difficult. And so as a result of that, if they try to do that, they will almost always fail. And the reason they're failing is the extraordinary efficiency, the knife's edge level imperative that is built into their motivational system that says, get the most calories back for the least amount of caloric effort. That literally gets people driving through a drive-through rather than walking across the parking lot. Okay, and that is the problem that they're facing, and that's where we begin the story, and then from there, amazingly, you're not even close to finished once you know. It's like then the journey begins. The journey begins with a single step of understanding that there's something wrong with your life. Then it's got 1,001 steps to go.
Yeah. And it feels like a razor's edge.
Yes.
I think you and I talked about the fact that I almost named Transform Shadows Dancing on the Razor's Ledge.
Yeah.
Because of something that you and I talked about. And I felt for a period of about 2 years that I was flailing on the razor's edge. And I didn't know how I was going to see my way through this, which is part of the reason why I ended up working with you on this. And there were a lot of things that I had figured out on my own, but there were things that I still needed help pulling the pieces together around, because even though eat when hungry is a binary idea, there are many dimensions around what that means, especially in this modern food environment where temptations surround us everywhere. And I felt like I was never going to find a sense of safety or peace. And I asked you specifically, was I going to feel like I was living on the razor's edge my whole life? And you told me that I would find a ledge, and it would be a more stable place the longer that I did it. And that has been true for sure. Also, understanding the whys of myself has been at the center of that. And so when I think about my own journey, understanding the why of myself, that includes some of these ideas about how I'm always going to go for the richest food in my environment, that has really helped me put bumpers around myself as I made some of these changes to understand the changes and then act in a way that lets myself succeed through the changes. And so I think what I would like to talk about next is what does it take to be successful, to get out of the addictive properties of the supernormal foods that surround us and into a healthy eating of plant-based living, which I always say what is good for my weight is also good for my health. And I want to start focusing a little bit more on some of those health benefits that come out of it, partly because of the fact that those should not be ignored, as well as the fact that once people get into a maintenance mode, the challenges are still there, but the health benefits, the longer you do this or the longer I've done it, and I think that is mirrored in other people, as well as the story you just talked about with your work at True North Health Center and some of the patterns that you see over and over again around healing and the fact that the body wants to heal. Those are things that I want to start speaking more about because it's added incentive to take on this lifestyle. And I'm at the age in my mid-50s where I see disease impacting more and more people that I know. And certainly I've had a lifetime of eating foods that cause disease that is part of my background. That concerns me. But the fact that I'm acting in my best interest now in a way that is healthy, and I do have some failures. That's, I think, to be expected when we're up against this particular problem. But I've found ways to fail so that I continue to succeed. And my failures are minor compared to what they used to be around health and wellness. And my failures before were so deep that I couldn't recover from them because I wasn't doing the right work around understanding my hunger drive and filling the food space or building that food fire with the right types of food. And so can you talk a little bit more about some of the mental processes that are required to move from that razor's edge to that ledge of safety, about what people go through when they do that?
Yeah, the problem, fundamental problem is that people are they're moving away, going directly against their instincts. So going against instinct is possible. So let me tell you sort of in theory what that means. So your instincts are essentially, they are the shadows of forgotten ancestors. They are the instructions about how to be a good member of your species. So they tell you, your instincts tell you what food is good, what smells smell dangerous, what sounds are scary or welcoming. So people love the sound of like a babbling brook. They like that. That's because that's the sound of water that's moving, and water that's moving very likely doesn't have bacterial contamination, so it's probably safe. Okay. They also like the sound because the water itself is a tremendous asset. So they like looking at a lake, even if the lake doesn't have a lot of noise. Just knowing that it's there, that's a tremendous asset for life. So those are instincts. We like the look of a green scene with a lot of different plant life. We don't like the look of a desert. That looks scary and cold and is intimidating. So your feelings, nobody tells you this. You just feel. And those are instincts. And you're designed to follow those instincts. So effectively, your instincts would tell you, go towards where there's a nice waterfall and a lot of greenery and flowers. That's the right place to go. Go away from the place that looks like a desert. That's the insignia of death. Okay? So if you could think about that, in other words, your mind doesn't, you don't consciously and haven't consciously identified, but the reason why you like the green scenery is because there's water and life and Therefore, there's chemicals in there that you need for your survival, i.e. H2O and a bunch of other things. Like, no. You just have a feeling. You have a sensation of excitement and relaxation and relief and a sense of aesthetic appreciation and beauty when you look at a beautiful scene. When you look at a desert, you've got a sense of foreboding. That's it. Okay? The same exact thing is happening with your food. We are basically asking people to go into the desert, to leave something that to their nervous system effectively looks like Hawaii, and to go into a place that looks like the Sahara. Okay? You're asking the human being to take one step after the next. Like literally, stare at your feet and keep moving into the Sahara, because that's how we're going to survive. Okay? That is what we are asking the human being to do in the modern environment. Now, that, of course, is not easy to do. So there are people that have done it, and all the little things that they find along the way, as you found, like little by little, you're feeling better. You know what I'm saying? You're feeling things start to change. It's like, whoa, you've got to be kidding me. And it's not really a desert. Yeah, maybe it is, but it's a desert that you are very capable of managing. People can manage on a whole natural foods diet. They don't need the richness, of fancy processed food. They can live very well. I mean, it's not a death desert. It's kind of a tough desert. You know what I mean? Like, you got to be smart about what you're doing. You got to be selective about your time and energy. You better be organized and you better be ready. And so these are all parts and parcels of effectively, being prepared for, harsh challenges. And that's what this is. But once you get good at it, and once you get very at home in the desert, one of the things that we find in that desert is that you could get complicated about everything, but you better keep it simple. You better keep it simple. In other words, one of the things people are leaving behind, this extraordinary environment of bizarre food, as John McDougall said 40 years ago. He said, you walk into the grocery store, there's 60,000 different items in there. Then a few years ago, he told me, okay, it's over 100,000. It's like, really? 100,000 different products in a grocery store.
Wow.
This creature was not designed by nature to restrain itself in the face of 100,000 concocted, unbelievable elixirs that tell it that it is won the grand prize of life, i.e., this is unbelievably rich for unbelievably low amount of energy. It's not designed to somehow restrain itself. So the people that have been successful almost uniformly that we have studied, they are people that have kept it simple. That there's 5, 6, 7 things that they eat, over and again. Their diets are very repetitive. They keep coming around to the same basic things, with a little bit of variation. So this is you get good at living in the desert, and you're kind of going to stay in the desert. And this is what we do in the desert. And when you do that, it turns out, you can live pretty well in the desert. You can be healthy and comfortable and lean, and you can feel good, and your digestive system feels good. It's kind of like, it's not unrelated to the notion of, all the lights are on now, and we can have lights 24 hours a day, and we can have fancy screens to look at. So every teenage kid and half the adults are staying up till 1 a.m. looking at it. Okay. But what if we go in the multimedia desert, and we even went back to the 1960s, where we had 3 channels on a TV, and everything's done by, kids go to bed at 9 o'clock and the TV goes off. What happens then? And the answer is, they get to sleep. And then they're not cranky and tired all the next day. And then they feel like running around at recess because they've got energy. Like that's how that works. And it feels like a desert to us now. relative to what's available now. And sometimes it can be like almost impossible to get an iPad or a cell phone out of a kid's hands at 11 o'clock at night. It's like, what happened? And the answer is we've adulterated the environment beyond all recognition. And and getting ourselves to a lean and appropriate environment, that's the most important and most difficult step that a person takes in this journey.
Yeah. And I come back to my words that I use to describe this process. When I was going through this process, I was using the words subdue my hunger drive and unravel it, because I knew that there was a lot I didn't understand about why I was obese. And I thought my journey was going to end by starting to think about myself as a food addict every single day. I recognized the addictive properties of the food. And yet, as I started going through the process, when I was really serious about the fact that I was going to make this my lifestyle and I was going to follow the path to learn whatever I needed to do to figure it out, I did that. And it was the beginning of the process. Understanding the addictive foods was only the first. I mean, it was an important step for me that took many decades to get to.
Mm-hmm.
But when I recognized that, I still had a whole lot of learning left to do that involved one day at a time, action step by action step, success, failure, and continuing to, bump my head against that process and beat my head against the process and come back at it over and over and over again. And with each time I experienced some of those trials and tribulations with it, I did learn, and I took the stance that failure was feedback. What can I learn from this situation that helps me unravel who I am to subdue my hunger drive? Again, I wasn't thinking about actually eating when hungry then. I was only thinking about subduing this force that led me to overeat and to binge eat. Those were things that I wanted to take care of in myself. So it is a very, very difficult, taxing process to go through that transition, because there are also things that take place around the foods that you're eating. One is withdrawal from these addictive food substances, and two, the food didn't taste very good. So, until I got used to it. And it took me a long time. I was not one of those 6-week people where the food tasted really good after 6 weeks. I just kept trusting the process, and it took a long, long time before the tastes really started to taste good to me. But people had said, trust the process. So I did. And so that's the message that I send to other people, because it's the only thing you can go on when you don't have the experiences, and you have to build some of those experiences to build your agency. Now, in that process of unraveling my hunger drive, one of the things that I came up against, which I think is very typical for people to come up against, and that is the idea of emotional eating. So as someone who got a hold of this in her 50s, I had been through many, many years of being conditioned to think about the fact that emotional eating and something that was broken in me was causing this, whether it was, some sort of event in childhood, or, something that I really needed to process from my mental standpoint because it was a shortcoming in my mind. So I want to really talk about the idea of emotional eating, because when I was going through those failures, what happened is that I started asking questions, relentless questions. Why is always the question that I kept coming to myself with. Why, during some times of difficulty and crisis, did I binge eat? And why did I get surprised in other times where I was facing challenges or crises of some kind that I didn't binge eat? And this was during the successful parts of my journey. And I started to correlate the fact that what I was eating was making a difference in how I was responding to emotional situations. And it wasn't the emotional shortcomings that were causing the binge eating so much as the foods that I was eating. And the way that I like to describe this is that I started to realize that these events were definitely emotional in nature, but there were things that I could eat that would help prevent the binge eating, as well as the recognition that when I had these events, I would get off in my groove. The balances that were working for me. And it was like fatigue of fighting this active force that's the center of gravity in my survival. The fatigue took over and I wasn't able to hold it all together anymore. And the deeper I got into that process, the more that I realized it was a physical process and not an emotional process that was the cause of it. Now, that being said, of course, emotional things were the things that kicked me out of balance. So there is that emotional component to it. But I realized in that part of the journey that I could do a whole lot more with my food that I was eating to prevent some of the things that were happening when life tips you upside down in some way. So could you talk more about emotional eating on that?
I'd love to, because you have perfectly described your experience sits right on top of everything that I have observed and understand about this. The common woman and man's understanding of what they've been told about why it is that they struggle is very far from the truth. And what you've described is perfect. Before I lose this, think of yourself as in a very narrow zone that sits between the desert, which is actually clean and healthy and simple and not very fancy and sexy, and then the theme park over there that looks like Hawaii, okay? And so your nervous system is designed by nature to obviously always be drifting and turning your head towards Hawaii, okay? Even though we may learn that, nope, you need to be going out into the desert. Okay, that's where we need to be living. So you can imagine if there's a little, consider our emotional life to be kind of like a breeze. So it might even be a mild wind. And if the mild wind pushes us, it's always going to push us from the wind comes from the desert. In other words, it's blowing us towards the pleasure trap, of course. So the way that wind works is, for example, we could be very stressed at work. And so if you're stressed at work or you're stressed in your life and you're under time pressure for some reason, now we start to get out of our organization. So now we're not very well organized. Now we, it could be other things, but now we're fatigued for some reason. And so now we don't go to the trouble of preparing well and we're not ready for the desert. Okay, well then now we're just going to go say, well, we're just going to go to where it's easy. The thing is that our emotional lives and our stressors is like a breeze. But once you hit the pleasure trap, it's a tsunami. That's the problem, okay? So the emotional turbulence of life is not a hurricane that blows you into the pleasure trap. At most, it's a little breeze. And most of the time when you get into the pleasure trap, it has nothing to do with that. It just has to do with the fact that it's shiny and interesting over there. Okay, that's all. You got a little too close and you smelled it. And it's like, wow, that sounds like an unbelievably big win. I think I'll just step over there for a minute and take a bite out of it. That's most of the reason people crash. And then once they do that, then they've got a pleasure trap tsunami. Now they're in trouble. Okay? And so then they may have a lot of emotions about that fact. And then they confuse it in their retrospective analysis that somehow this was a big emotionally turbulent phenomenon. This would be a mistake to look at it this way. This is, you are looking for the solution to the problem of food addiction, pleasure trap, etc. You're looking in the wrong place if you're looking to your emotional life. Okay, from a strictly scientific point of view, this has actually been studied, and there is no correlation at all between people eating junky food and being in emotionally distraught circumstances. Like when it's actually been measured as best it can be measured by modern social science, it's not discovered. And this is me looking at myself too over the last 40 years. Whenever I've gotten into junk food, it isn't because some girl broke up with me. It's because it was available, for God's sakes, and somebody offered it to me. That's the problem. The overwhelming likelihood of stepping into the pleasure trap is that you get seduced into it by availability and your own nature. Okay? Once that happens, it's a firestorm, or it can be, because it's the pleasure trap. Okay, so it takes so I look at emotional eating and the emotions around it. I say most of the emotions around it happen after we got into the trouble, not before. Sometimes life and its stresses, including emotional challenges, but oftentimes it's just time pressure, stress, and fatigue, which is super common. That will get people out of their groove. To live in the desert, you better get your sleep, you better be organized. Hopefully you don't get sick, and so therefore you're not laid up, and now we wind up with time pressure at work, and we're 4 days behind, and these are exactly the kinds of things that can get people out of their groove. You know what I'm saying? Your husband or wife breaks her leg, and now you got to take care of them, and now what have we got? Oh, we got time pressure, and now we get out of our groove. And right over there is the theme park. All it's saying is, just step over here for a little while. Just take it easy. You know, you got so much going on. Just come over here where the calories are really easy to get. That seems reasonable, for goodness sakes. Why are you being so stubborn and living in the desert when you can just live over here? And so it's exactly these kinds of times that, yes, there is a little bit of turbulence of life in some way or the other, or there's just opportunity. And we step right over there into the theme park, and now we're being seduced by the trap. So I think that people something resonates about emotional eating, probably because if they're trying to do this, when they fail, it is emotional. So that's it. And I also believe that people assume very falsely that this should be easy and simple, because particularly people that have been educated in this space and are wanting to execute, they believe that they should be able to execute if they understand what to do. So I have had 100 people tell me, I don't know what the matter is with me. I know exactly what to do, i.e., I'm calling you, Dr. Lisle. I don't know why I'm even calling you, because I know exactly what to do. I just won't do it. Okay? And the answer, and they're thinking that there's something mysteriously wrong with them psychologically. And that will lead to the witch hunt for emotional dynamics. That is a mistake. Okay? That is a misunderstanding of the problem, what it is that you're facing. Very few people have alcohol problems because they have emotional problems that lead to the alcohol. That is a deep misunderstanding. There are emotional problems that result from an alcohol problem, but the alcohol is a part of the pleasure trap. It's seductive. It is supernormal. It causes a heightened pleasure reaction. And therefore, if you are genetically susceptible, it can grab you, okay? The process of grabbing you and the life turbulence that results is very emotional. But that's the result, not the cause, okay? The reason why people become alcoholics isn't because when they're 17 years old, they're having a tough time in life and they decide to drink their troubles away. My very first client was a sociable, bright, pretty young lady at the University of Virginia. And she I was a counselor there going to grad school, and she was a young undergraduate. And she came into me and she said, I've been an alcoholic since I was 16. She said, I knew from the very first beer. Very interesting. She didn't drink that beer because she had emotional problems. She drank that beer because everybody else was doing it, and it was a fun, cool adult thing to do. Okay. And as soon as she had her first beer, she discovered inside of herself the alcoholic gene. She had a high, supernormal, unnaturally high dopamine response to that alcohol, which happens in about 5% of people. And that was it. And she's in my office 4 years later telling me I'm completely out of control, I'm in trouble, and I don't know what to do. Okay? In other words, that's what that is. The same thing is true with junk food. The same thing is true with the modern food supply. We are all inherently latent addicts, not at the intense level of a hard drug, but it's the same exact neurochemical cascade. It's the same process. And it's the same seduction. And unlike these other things, it's not a few people that are into it, or some little group or in specialized times. It's every day, all around you. You're surrounded with it, with an energy conserving calorie acquisition, imperative that will say, well, what's the right choice? Are we going to step into the desert with our pocket knife and our courage? Or are we going to go to the left and go where it's easy? It's like it doesn't take an emotional basket case to take a left-hand turn and go to where it's easy. It takes a rational human being that is not at that moment knowledgeable enough or determined enough or stable enough for whatever reason to defend their desire and need to go to the desert. Okay? So that's, blaming emotional eating will also be a way of self-handicapping and giving an excuse out of our embarrassment that we have not been successful. A reason for me to speak out against this, as I've done consistently, is to basically say, listen, don't fall into the trap, but this is the excuse that explains why you have been unsuccessful, and therefore we give you special dispensation and don't look down on you because you have failed. If we fall into that trap, we are not actually accurately identifying the reasons for your failure. We are misassigning it to something that makes you somehow look better. But the truth is that if you fall into that misinformation, which is highly seductive misinformation, you are missing the point. This is a very hard journey. We would expect almost nobody to succeed because it's so seductive. If you fail, it isn't because you have something emotionally that needs to be fixed in your life. You are failing because the task is very difficult. It seems so simple. I know everything, Dr. Lyle. Why can't I just do it? It's because every instinct in you is designed by nature to go exactly the wrong direction. That's why. Okay? You have to understand and respect that in order to get ready for the desert, to plan for the desert, to get comfortable for the desert, to get used to the desert. And then when you get the wind that blows you the seductive direction, you have to say, that's a trap. Okay? It looks beautiful. It's like some ex that was really sexy, but was just hell on wheels. That's what it's like. Okay? And it very much is like that. It's like, and then when we step into it again and get into trouble, it's just like going and sleeping with your ex. It's like, oh man, I remember how great this was, and then a little while later, it's like, oh man, I remember why I left this thing. It's a fiasco and it's a disaster. That's what it's like.
And that brings me to one of my mantras, actually, that especially when I was in that process of unraveling and subduing and figuring out reassigning the cause-effect relationship, which is no small thing. That's part of the disconcerting nature of this journey, is that you figure out that the cause-effect sequences that you've learned at least I've learned in mainstream society, were all backwards. And that's discombobulating in this journey. But I want to say that one of my mantras became, if you do what you've always done, you will get the same results over and over and over again. And it really did help me, and does help me when I come close to straying. One of the terms that I use a lot around my failures, even though they may not seem per se like failures, now that I'm not failing with French fries, I'm not failing with potato chips, which were my biggest trigger, or chocolate or pizza or whatever. I fail within the plant-based world, absolutely without salt, oil, and sugar, because I know that the foods without salt, oil, and sugar and other processed pieces like flour and that sort of thing, I know that I can recover, because the hold is not nearly as deep in me as it is with those supernormal foods. And something that people are responding to in how I speak about this is that I talk about a failure plan. I talk about failure regularly, and I very clearly label to myself when I start straying from what is optimal for me. I call that failure. And the reason is very deliberate. It is because this is a slippery slope. And going back to something that you said earlier about humans coming up with all sorts of fantastical ideas around eating and food and what may be true and that sort of thing, I have a sense of how my distortions work in me now. And I know that I will get distorted thinking about the food. And if I say I failed with it, it helps me realize the slippery slope that I'm on, and how quickly one choice leads to another choice. And so another mantra I use is recover from failure in a timely manner, because I've been partly, how do I say it? Inaction has been one of my patterns, paralyzed and saying, it's going to start tomorrow, which I think gets us into some of that psychological dimension, right? And I want to talk about that more, because in our last episode, you said that sometimes you feel like you go all anti-psychology on this as a psychologist, but psychology sits right in the middle of things. And I'm wondering if you can talk more about what that means, because I think if people understand how psychology plays a role in food and hunger, that can help them with their food and their eating patterns too. And certainly it can be an answer for some of those people who come to you. And I'm getting those people now too, as I work with more and more people who say they know what to do, but they need to figure out how to do it. So how does psychology sit in the middle of this thing?
Yeah, it's a grand question. And I can't believe how much more I know now than I knew, 40 years ago, when I first just learned, oh, this is the right direction to go. And then you start battling the pleasure trap. And then it turns out that you see yourself and then a whole bunch of other people struggle and many people fail who desperately want to succeed. And then you listen to their inferences about why it is that's supposedly happening. And what we get is a bunch of trauma theory and emotional handicapping and all this sort of thing. And it's not even close to the truth. The psychology, so it sounds like I'm very anti-psychology, but what I am is I'm anti-erroneous psychology. Psychology absolutely sits in the middle of this thing. But in order to understand the psychology that is driving this train, we have to understand why the mind was built. And also, it's useful to understand where it was built. So the mind that you have was built somewhere on or near the Kalahari in southern Africa over the last 1,000,000 years. This is a mind that was designed by nature. We know, because if you go visit the Bushmen of the Kalahari today, they're still there. Now they've been treated badly. They've been hunted by different countries and regimes, so that they can move them off their They're roaming lands so that people can dig for diamonds. You know what I mean? But the point is, we know from genetic testing, this is the oldest DNA on Earth. These are the people that are there are the descendants, the direct descendants of the earliest humans, and we are essentially descendants of genetically, we're descendants of the people that you're staring at, and we can learn an awful lot about human beings by looking at effectively the original human culture, because they're still doing the same things they've been doing for hundreds of thousands of years. And there's certain things you're going to find there. You're going to find, for example, that there's no drug addiction. Like, oh, well, that's interesting. There's no drug addiction. So the big fat book called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Psychiatry that gives all the diagnoses for all the human problems that we're supposed to be trying to solve. Literally, you can take a big chunk out of it, throw it in the trash, because guess what? It's not a disorder, because it doesn't exist in human nature. Okay? Then you can look at all the medical problems that, like, for example, obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease. Well, you can look at that and you can just throw those all in the trash because those don't exist there. Doesn't happen. Okay? You can look at some other things like loneliness, and the depression that's associated with that, and lack of connection with other people. Doesn't exist, never happens. Okay? You can look at the feeling that people have of like their work doesn't matter, that it's disconnected, that it just doesn't feel like they're accomplishing anything meaningful in this life. Never. Impossible. Okay? Feeling like, gee, people at work, I don't get along with them. I don't like my boss. I kind of don't like what I'm doing that much socially. It's kind of uncomfortable. Never. You hung out your whole life every single day doing the most productive work possible with your 5 best friends. That's how it is. There isn't a person that lives there that says, at the end of this life, I never really did that thing that I really wanted to do. I never, was able to perform or be a model or an actress or a poet or a playwright or a carver or a painter, or just express myself artistically, or a fashion designer. No, they all did that. That was the most important thing they did in their lives, just as soon as they made sure they had enough to eat and they had enough to eat for their children. That life was a never-ending traveling talent show, and everybody participated as both a member of the audience and as a member of the production, of course. Okay? We see that desire inside of humans today. And so when we start trying to figure out why people have the problems that they have, it's useful to understand where you came from, how you're built, what was the environment that you were designed for, what is in fact your nature. And if you visit the Bushmen of the Kalahari, you'll find out that they have to be very, very efficient at what it is that they do. They are crafty and they are very knowledgeable about getting their calories out of the environment because it's scarce. Okay, they're good. Tribe rarely starves to death, but that doesn't mean that they don't have some dicey times during the year, and that that they don't have to be thinking ahead, and that they don't have to be prepared and ready. And when the bounty comes, believe me, they gobble it up. Some guy gets into a beehive and is willing to brave the bees, and everybody's all excited about it, and he's a hero because they're chomping on that honey for a while till it's gone. And if they make a big kill, they're excited about it. If there's a nut tree that they get to that the squirrels and the monkeys didn't get there first, that's good, and we get there. So we are living in a chronic state of semi-deprivation, meaning that we have to be super efficient about our decisions and not be a fool and eat the food that is less calorie dense instead of the food that's more calorie dense if it's available. That is the design of the system. The system is designed to be really good at remembering where the rich food was, even the time of year where it was available, and to be motivated to be seeking it out and take risks to get it. You can imagine if you put that mind in a person in the moderate environment, that is a recipe for gluttony and disaster. That is not because the person in the moderate environment has emotional troubles that are driving them there. It's because they've got algorithms that were designed and shaped ruthlessly by evolution as a bush person of the Kalahari to make damn sure we survived. Okay, that's what you're up against. And so that same problem is the same other hauntings that we see. It's like, oh, we've traded a lot in our modern environment for an environment of plenty and security, all kinds of things. I mean, we don't want to go back and live on the Kalahari Desert. But we see, if we look across as the shadows that you would talk about, if we look behind things, we see an immense amount that we have actually left behind. And we can actually look in those shadows and find the reasons for so much of the human struggles and angst that we see today. Okay, there it is. There's no unemployment on the Kalahari. There's no lack of connection on the Kalahari. There's no feeling of my work doesn't matter on the Kalahari. There's no unexplored creative activity on the Kalahari. It's like there's no diseases of dietary excess on the Kalahari. It's like, holy smokes, look around, wake up. This is what we needed to learn about ourselves. And once we learn that about ourselves, then you've got a clear idea of just how difficult this problem is. And you respect the lure of Magic Land, which is where we live now. Okay? It's a seductive, it's a very seductive theme park. And, if you're not careful, it can be, a waste.
I think that seductivity goes a couple different directions on it too, because I think also not just with the magic of the theme park that is the attraction. As I went through this experience, my experience is very much defined by COVID and doing most of my weight loss. Really, no one even said anything before I went into COVID. And then I came out of COVID and I went from morbid obesity to a healthy weight by the time most people saw me. And that's pretty dramatic when you lose half your body weight. So yes. Most people didn't say anything in my circles, but sometimes people said things. And I think the seductive question here is that people were trying to get at the trauma that I had experienced and the trauma that I had fixed. And they wanted to know about that. And I liken that to kind of the human tendency, mine included, when I pass an accident, to look and to want to observe what's going on. And I felt that over and over again in the questions that people were asking me, even in some of the later things that I've done that have been public tellings of my story. People want to get at the drama that's there, and it's even better if it's trauma, and it's even best if I cry, and it's even better yet if I've told no one about it, because then people have the scoop. And all of that, I think, is an incredibly seductive way to look at weight loss. And so I know we talked about emotional eating, but we just went into a why. But I also want to specifically address trauma, because I think a lot of people see trauma as the reason why they might be overweight or obese as well. So could you comment on that?
Yes. Well, trauma is the kissing cousin of emotional eating. So it's just trauma would be, in principle, then the reason for reverberations of emotional turbulence indefinitely in one's life that would then cause us to have addictive type problems or self-destructive type tendencies. None of this is true. So this is trauma is just a word for a big loss and a bad, painful experience. So if we change the wording, suddenly it becomes a little less mysterious and doesn't have mystical power. So but it has mystical power, and it's had mystical power for a long time. And this was promulgated by Sigmund Freud. He wasn't the only person thinking this way. but his ideas were the pushiest and most dramatic. And I think he probably believed it. I think he did believe these things, but he had completely great misunderstandings about child development and human beings and traumatic events. Traumatic events happen to animals and people. And when they do, they don't cause dysfunction. They cause the animal to be wary and to code for anxiety under highly, tightly organized circumstances. If you are a rabbit and you are nearly eaten because you didn't see a fox, in a little swale, you are now not so terrorized that you don't go, out, looking for carrots. Of course not. You can't do that. What you do is you are particularly going to be smart about that particular place where, for some strange reason, you didn't know a swale was there. And so you will never forget that. In other words, you are now better informed about a vulnerability that you had. When we've had a traumatic event, something happened that we didn't anticipate. If we anticipated it, then it's not traumatic. It's like, okay, here it comes. We're ready. We're bracing ourselves. There's a conflict of interest between us and some other person, or between us and nature. And it's going to be tough. And, et cetera. What makes traumatic events particularly traumatic, memorable and important, is that generally we didn't see it coming. Mm. And so therefore we now learned about a vulnerability that we didn't know existed. And so now, as a result of that, so a woman, for example, is sexually assaulted, and she didn't see it coming. She's gone out with 9 young men, and she's 26 years old, and she didn't see this one coming. Okay, and so now what happens? Does this destroy her psychology forever? Of course not. If you are a woman in the Kalahari and you're down by the river and you have 3 children and you turn your back and a crocodile grabs one of them and runs off with it, you'll never forget it. Okay? It's a horrendous experience. You experience a tremendous loss. But it doesn't wreck your life. What it does is it informs you and you become more careful in the future. That is the only possible way that the mind can be organized and the way it's designed. So you are motivated to avoid things that look like they are going to rise that vulnerability. So if you're a young woman and you had something like that happen, you are on the alert for what the elements of the situation are that gave rise to that. What was there in that situation that you could have smelled that trouble and didn't? And if you were just purely blindsided, then you note that and you recognize that you're going to have to be more careful about something about this into the future. But it will not stop you from falling in love or finding people attractive and seeking romance. But it will make you more careful. And for a period of time, you may, like a boxer who has just badly lost an important match and is pretty beat up, you're not interested in fighting for a while. You know what I mean? You've got to pull in your horns and you've got to consolidate and you've got to think and you've got to figure out what mistakes that you made. That is exactly what trauma does. Trauma does not have reverberating, disastrous, recurrent, self-destructive patterns of behavior that emanate from it for the rest of the animal's life. That would be insane. That is, in fact, evolutionarily impossible. Okay? But that is, in fact, the theory that was promulgated by Sigmund Freud. He believed that that was true. And because he was Freud, because his thinking, rang true in certain areas and was wildly speculative and imaginative and ingenious in others, almost all of it was wrong. And it was badly wrong. And this is one that he really got wrong. Okay. Freud couldn't understand why he would meet people at 35 that were neurotic and irritable and pain in the ass and difficult socially. And he looked at that, and his intuition was, that can't be human nature. That can't be. That must be dysfunction. Okay? He was wrong about that. That is that specific individual's nature. Those characteristics are, in fact, inherited. Okay? He would not have known that. How could he? Okay? The baby doesn't look like it's an irritable, argumentative, emotionally unstable mess. It's just a baby, for goodness sakes. How could it have turned into that person when another person turned out so beautifully and sweet and pleasant and nice? It must have been damage that caused this problem. Okay? It must have been damage that caused the person to be a hand washer. It must have been damage that caused the person to be obese. It must have been damage that caused the person to be an alcoholic. He was trying to figure out why you had bad outcomes or uncomfortable things, or i.e. dysfunction, i.e. it's certainly socially dysfunctional to be argumentative and difficult and unstable, etc. True. But he could not understand why that was happening, and he absolutely believed that it must have been early childhood damage, because there might not have been a trauma history later that the person could ever recall, no, I had a happy childhood. Must have happened earlier then. Okay. No, I wasn't, I didn't have this level of trouble. No, I wasn't abused by anybody. But no, I just feel this way. What else would Freud have thought? And so, as following that lead, other people couldn't figure it out either. So the truth about that wasn't discovered until 1985 at the University of Minnesota. And that is a very unpopular truth about that. So to this day, people believe that the reason why the person overeats, or the reason why the person has an alcohol problem, or the reason why they have this issue must have been from some early childhood or traumatic experiences. That is a terrible misunderstanding. It creates chaos in all kinds of treatment domains. It creates blind alleys, and it creates actually very interesting and convenient social defenses against actually recognizing the truth and being able to see self-responsibility when it's in front of us. So yes, trauma is a vastly and deeply misunderstood phenomenon. Trauma, translate the word trauma out of its mystery and its psychodynamic aura and translate it into plain English. Unpleasant, painful losses. Unpleasant, painful loss experiences help us learn lessons. I have many fine memories, and I can remember them, where the fancy food was or where the pretty girl was when I met her, okay? But I'll tell you what, I have other memories about when trouble happened, when there was something very painful. I remember those things too. It's just as important to remember those, to have those filed away in our memory in case those things come up again. You know what I'm saying? Unpleasant people. No, don't want to talk to that guy. Okay. Dangerous circumstances. I'll never again take a cab from a guy in Mexico City that doesn't have a little thing on his car that says, hey, would you like me to give you a tour? I can't believe I did that. Fortunately, he was a trustworthy, completely wonderful man, but I can't believe in retrospect that I took that kind of chance. Wow. But the point is that we've all had moments where we've experienced big losses and got scared, and even might have had some damage done to us financially, emotionally, physically, in some way. We learn, okay? We learn, we survive, and we move on, and we are wiser. And that's what trauma actually does to us. It makes us smarter.
Well, and to be clear, I think this is an example of where that cause-effect piece is uprooted yet again, because in episode 4 on binge eating, we talked about how the size of a body does not equate the size of a binge. And right. I experienced that in my own thinking and my own self-perception. So the other thing that I've encountered, which I was talking about before you gave this really helpful answer, was that people assumed that the size of my body was indicative of the size of a trauma. And that is something that I want to be clear in speaking to, because I keep coming back to all the different ways in this journey. I was not broken and I am not fixed. And this is a big one where people think that others are broken because of their size. I thought I was broken because of my size. And like a person trying to figure it out, I contorted my experiences into all sorts of, things that really didn't hold true or make sense, trying to get my experiences to fit the theory and figure out what it was I needed to fix in order to get a hold of my weight. It didn't work because it wasn't the right cause-effect relationship. And so I think to speak clearly to that can then help people understand the next step, which is to get into the food choices and what it means to choose the food choices that center health, that center life away from the pleasure trap, that are going, we've got two metaphors going through. You've got the desert and the beautiful scenery, and I've got the build a fire. So in the building of the fire, this is something that people have agency in. And that I keep wanting to say, that one of my taglines is find your power. For myself as well, it's find my power, it's find your power, and the message of empowerment, because we do have control over what we eat, but it is a hard journey. And so I want to take apart some of the food pieces conceptually so that people can maybe think about their food a little bit differently as they construct a journey like that, whether they are working to actually take what they know and follow through on it, or whether they're learning about this for the first time as they're encountering some of our conversations. So let's talk about satiation and food choices and what it takes to be successful from a conceptual level, so that we can help people discover that inner agency. Do you have anything that you would start with on that?
I would say, I think that's a pretty big discussion. And I think maybe we need to do that one next time.
Yes.
Yeah. I think that naturally leads from here. And so the thing I like about our discussions is we have a general direction we're going, but we're not exactly sure. Yeah. We know we're eating whole natural foods, but we're not exactly sure which ones we're eating. Yeah. And so, I think this is a good place for us to wind up for one go around, and then we'll come back and pick this up in our next episode.
I agree. And time flies when we're having these conversations. I have to say that, because they're definitely engaging, thought-provoking, and hopefully meaningful for people who are watching as well. We left off on a big one, which is really uprooting the notion that something is wrong because you struggle with making these choices or your weight. And that, I think, has been really a primary thing that we've been able to work through from a broad perspective to a specific perspective that hopefully leaves a message of empowerment as we conclude this particular episode. So thank you again for joining me, Dr. Lisle, on this fascinating exploration of what it means to eat when hungry, because there's a lot involved.
Fantastic. Thank you again. Thanks for having me.
Yes. All right. Thank you.